In the next 15 minutes, I'm gonna show you the key settings that professional content creators change on their iPhones to shoot beautiful videos. Some of these settings by themselves will destroy the quality of your videos if we're not careful with how we use them. Let's dive in. What's up, creators? My name is Anthony from contentcreator.com, and the first thing we need to talk about is HDR mode, or high dynamic range mode. Dynamic range is essentially the amount of detail your camera can capture in both the highlights and the shadows at the same time. Bad dynamic range looks something like this, whereas good dynamic range looks like this. Despite the fact that it sounds like an amazing setting to turn on, leaving it off and filming in SDR, or standard dynamic range mode, is the better choice for most people. Give some HDR footage a quick glance and it might seem like it's higher quality, but in reality, when you look closely at it, it always tends to shift the color of skin tones, and it adds an unnatural look to the videos because it's pushing those highlights and shadows so much. Let's look at it on a graph. If the goal is to have great dynamic range while also looking natural, HDR mode definitely increases the dynamic range, but in doing so, we lose that natural look, which can make our content appear amateur. On the flip side, filming in SDR will deliver almost the same amount of dynamic range while nailing that natural look straight out of camera, meaning you really don't need to edit or color correct this footage at all. To turn HDR mode off, you hit the main settings icon, scroll down to the camera, hit video format, and then turn the slider for HDR off, which puts it back into SDR mode. Okay, up next we have to talk about what was probably the most exciting new feature of the iPhone 15 series: the ability to shoot in ProRes video in a log picture profile. If you have an iPhone 15, I'll let you know if it's worth shooting in log, and if you have an older model, we can talk about if it's even worth upgrading. Okay, so this is what log footage looks like. This whole video is being filmed in log on an iPhone 15. Notice how flat and low contrast this video is. It's not super exciting to the untrained eye, but log footage actually has everything to do with dynamic range, which we talked about earlier. By filming in this flat picture profile, we increase the total potential dynamic range of the shot, so with some fancy color correction, we're able to bring all that contrast back and create a final image with theoretically more dynamic range than if we shot in a non-log profile. Now, how much dynamic range does it really add? It's actually kind of hard to tell, because looking at it side by side against the SDR footage from a moment ago, with how much iPhones auto edit the SDR footage as it's being shot, both actually have great dynamic range. And you could kind of argue the SDR has even better dynamic range, even though it's kind of manufactured dynamic range because the camera's auto editing the footage. Now, all that stuff aside, the main difference that actually stands out to me with log footage is the fact that Apple finally got rid of that crazy digital over sharpening effect that pretty much all smartphones have. When we compare the over sharpened SDR footage to the log footage, this is where the true superpower comes into play. Look closely at the details of my face, particularly the beard. The log footage looks much more natural compared to the digitally sharpened SDR footage. All right, so now that we can see the differences, what should we do with the setting? If you do own an iPhone 15, despite the over sharpening, I'd still recommend sticking in the regular SDR mode for the majority of content you shoot, and only switch into log mode when you absolutely need to squeeze as much juice out of your camera as possible. The reason I suggest doing this is twofold. The first reason is because the files are absolutely massive when you shoot in log. Even super short videos under a minute long can be tens and tens of gigabytes, so you'll run out of space real fast. Now, the second reason I recommend a lot of people avoid log has to do with the fact that you also need to know how to color correct and color grade footage in order to get the most out of log. And understanding how to color correct and color grade is a relatively advanced skill set. So if somebody picking up a camera for the first time switches it into log, odds are their footage is not going to look like this. It's going to look like this or like this. So in reality, despite the fact that it's a professional setting, it doesn't just automatically make your footage look good. You're still gonna need that advanced skill set of color correction and color grading. Now, color correction and grading is an entire topic by itself, so I won't touch on it too much in this video, but I do have an entire training on it in our online course, 14-Day Filmmaker Smartphone Edition, along with a downloadable preset you can use to get that cinematic look with the click of a button. The course only costs $48, and it includes over 150 video tutorials specifically designed to help you maximize the quality of the videos you shoot and edit. More on that later though. Up next, we have to talk about cinematic mode. Everyone wants to have that dreamy, blurry background with their content, and cinematic mode is how we get that look on our smartphones, but how often should we use it? Similar to filming in log, 80 to 90% of the time I'm filming on my iPhone, I'm in the regular SDR mode without cinematic mode turned on. SDR mode is really the perfect all-around setting for filming almost any content. However, when I have a very controlled scene like I do now, where the lighting is set up, the subject is clearly defined, I do think it's a great idea to turn cinematic mode on to increase that perceived depth of field. And just so you can see the difference, this is what the same scene looks like filmed in cinematic mode. You tell me in the comments below, which do you prefer, regular or cinematic mode? Now, very important here, when I do use cinematic mode, I always click the little F icon and increase the digital aperture to around 3 to 4. This gives a much more natural looking background blur. If you crank the blur up as much as it can go, it's super easy to tell that it's all digital blur and it becomes a distraction in the video rather than a benefit. Okay, we have 4 more major settings that we need to touch on that will drastically impact the quality of your content. And especially if you want your social media content to look good, this next one is crucial to understand. Resolution. This is a pretty straightforward setting, but like most things, the devil is in the detail. 4K is the highest resolution that we're able to film on iPhones, and I highly recommend you record all of your videos in 4K resolution. The only issue here is that most social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, they don't natively support 4K video, and they'll actually compress the video you post to save space, which can really impact the quality in a bad way. So the solution is to film everything in 4K, but after editing the video, you want to make sure that when you're choosing your export settings, you downscale the video and export it in 1080p. This will retain a lot of the benefits of shooting in 4K, but it will reduce the file size so that Instagram won't have to compress your content and ruin the quality. Generally speaking, I aim to have my videos in the 10 to 60 megabyte range. Now, after resolution, we need to talk about frame rate. 24, 30, 60, 120, what's the best frame rate for your content? Well, before I tell you the answer, I want to quickly outline what frame rate is. The number represents how many individual still frames are captured per second of video footage. The biggest impact frame rate has on our content is its connection to slow motion. The higher the frame rate, the more we can stretch out the frames and slow the video down. And for some videos, slow motion is a super cool attention-grabbing tool that we can use. Now, the 2 standard base frame rates that most content is shot and edited in is 24 and 30 frames per second. This is regular speed content. The video you're watching right now was filmed at 24 frames per second. You really can't and shouldn't attempt to slow it down at all. If you do, the video is going to look like this, where you can very clearly see the pauses in between each still frame of the video. This is a huge amateur mistake that I see all the time in edits. 24 and 30 frames per second are almost interchangeable. The vast majority of people really never consciously pick up on a difference between the two, but I generally tell people if you want to match the Hollywood look, film in 24 frames per second. That's what most Hollywood movies are shot in. Now, on the flip side, if you want to match the internet influencer content creator look, film in 30 frames per second. You're gonna hear people on the internet recommend both frame rates, and that's because it really comes down to personal preference at this point. Now, the only time I don't is when I want slow motion, and if that's the case, I will increase the frame rate, usually to 60, 120, or 240 frames per second. The higher the number, the more you're able to slow it down before getting those unnatural pauses in between the frames. What I recommend you do right now is open up the settings app on your phone, click on the camera, then select record video. This is where you'll set your default resolution and frame rate. I've selected 4K at 24 frames per second. Now, actually, while we're here in this menu, I want to quickly go over some more important settings that you want to modify. Make sure enhanced stabilization is on. This will drastically improve the smoothness of your moving shots. Check action mode, lower light on. HDR mode is off, we already touched on that. Turn auto FPS off. This way the camera doesn't automatically change your frame rate without you knowing. Turn lock camera on. This will make sure that you don't get that very uncinematic shift between cameras when you're zooming in and out. And finally, one of the most important settings you can control, make sure lock white balance is set to on. This will make sure that when you're filming, the auto white balance stays locked throughout the duration of the entire clip. This way you won't have an awkward shift halfway through your video. After this, let's go back and select record slow-mo and ensure that we're in 1080p at 240 frames per second. This is going to give us the most slow motion possible. If your settings look different, basically you want to choose the highest frame rate option while still being in 1080p. I definitely wouldn't recommend filming in 720p. If you ever want to quickly change it while you're in the app, you can swap to 120 frames per second by tapping in the corner. After that, for record cinematic, just make sure it matches the exact resolution and frame rate you chose for the top video setting. For me, I have them both set to 4K at 24 frames per second. Up next, we'll want to make sure both grid and level are switched on, and these are actually crucial in my eyes, especially the level. Both of these tools help us better compose our scenes, which is one of the biggest things that impacts the quality of your videos. With these turned on, we can make sure we follow the rule of thirds by positioning our subjects along the intersections of these grid lines, and then we can also make sure our horizon is always level and not skewed by using the level tool. This may sound small, but trust me, an unlevel horizon is a huge telltale sign of an amateur content creator. Okay, last two major settings, and unfortunately they come with some bad news. We can't take full control of them within the native iPhone app, but this isn't the end of the world. The last two settings are shutter speed and ISO, and for some reason Apple has always removed the ability to control these within the native app. They prefer using their auto exposure mode to do all the decision making for you. Now, there are third-party apps that you can download from the App Store that allow you to take full control of all these settings, but realistically, you don't need them to shoot cinematic videos. Now, because we can't control these manually on the native app, we don't need to spend a half hour explaining them. Instead, I want to tell you what you actually need to know to shoot the best quality content possible using your iPhone. So remember, these settings have everything to do with exposure, or how bright or dark your video is. Now, when it comes to brightness and darkness, there are three general scenarios we find ourselves in when we're shooting content, and I'm going to tell you how to handle each one. Up first, we have even lighting. This is like placing your subject near a window or filming outside on a cloudy day where we just have the perfect amount of light. In this situation, we do absolutely nothing. Let the camera handle everything through auto exposure and you're good to go. After this, the second scenario is ultra bright, like filming outside on a sunny day. In this scenario, the phone's auto exposure will do a good job of exposing the scene. But to do that, it's going to crank up the shutter speed setting by quite a bit. Now, this is hard to see with the untrained eye, but what this does is eliminate motion blur in your video. Despite sounding bad, motion blur is actually a good thing. Our eyes naturally pick up on it, so we also want to try to replicate it within our cameras. By freezing this video mid-clip, you can see that this is good motion blur, and then this is no motion blur, which is bad. To solve this in ultra bright scenarios, we use what's called a variable ND filter. I can attach it to my camera using a universal filter mount and a step-up ring to match the two filter sizes. The ND filter is basically like sunglasses for your camera. It cuts down on the ultra bright light. This allows the auto exposure to then properly set the shutter speed where it's supposed to be, which will keep our video looking perfectly exposed, but we'll have that beautiful motion blur back in our shots. By the way, I'll link the exact filters and other gear I use in the description below. Now, finally, the third exposure scenario is low light. This is pretty much any time we're filming indoors without professional lighting or after sunset outdoors. In low light situations, your camera's auto exposure will increase the ISO, which will make the scene look brighter on camera, but it also introduces this terrible looking noise, which basically kills the professional quality of your videos. Now, I want to be very clear here. There is no magic setting on your camera that will make a low light scene look good. Low light is basically the bane of all content creators. So without any settings to help us here, the only thing that we can do is to introduce more light to the scene somehow. You can move your subject closer to a window or to a light within the scene. You can rotate the subject so they're getting hit by the sun more. Or you can do what most content creators do, which is introduce a soft light source to the scene like I have here in my office. For reference, this is what the scene looks like on full auto exposure with the light on, and this is what the same scene looks like in auto exposure with the light off. That is how much of a crazy difference one professional light can make. I think a big mistake amateur content creators make is assuming they have enough light in their scene, even though it's definitely low light. Then they blame their camera for shooting a video that doesn't live up to their standard of quality, when in reality, it's not the camera's fault. We were just in a scene that didn't have enough light. Lighting is by far and away the #1 thing that impacts the quality of your videos. And if you click the card somewhere above, I've actually linked another video on our channel where we go through the entire process of shooting a talking head YouTube video on a smartphone, where I also break down my favorite budget-friendly lighting setup for YouTube videos. And that right there officially covers all of the primary settings you need to know to shoot beautiful cinematic content using the iPhone that's always in your pocket. And as a bonus, we also covered the 3 primary lighting scenarios that you'll find yourself in. Now, I mentioned it earlier in this video, but at contentcreator.com, we have an online course that's helped over 100,000 people master literally every aspect of shooting and editing content using their smartphones. It's called 14-Day Filmmaker, and if you enjoyed the training in this YouTube video, the content in this course will literally blow your mind. Not to mention you get access to hundreds of dollars worth of resources, downloadable cheat sheets, templates, and discounts on pro software. By enrolling, you get lifetime access to the course, the private student community where I personally host a weekly live Q&A call to answer any questions you have, and so much more for a single payment of $48, which only helps support our business so we can keep putting out super valuable YouTube videos, additional courses, all that fun stuff. We're so confident that this program will help you create better YouTube videos, social media videos, commercials, and more, that if you don't love it, you can just get all your money back. You can learn more and enroll by clicking the first link in the description below. But enough about 14-Day Filmmaker. Thank you again, as always, for watching this video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.